In the 1960s, a staggering 70% of all taxis in Chicago and 60% in New York City were forged in one single factory in Kalamazoo, Michigan. They built indestructible steel machines capable of conquering 500,000 miles, completely dominating American streets for decades. Then the deafening roar of the welding torches suddenly went dead. The assembly lines stopped forever in 1982, throwing hundreds of master craftsmen out onto the streets. What destroyed the greatest taxi empire in history? And why did building the perfect machine become a brutal death sentence for this legendary factory? The genesis of the American taxi empire did not occur within the gleaming, well-funded engineering laboratories of Detroit. Instead, the foundation of this automotive monolith was laid in the suffocating, densely packed garment manufacturing district of Chicago in the early 1920s. As dense coal smoke settled over the Great Lakes rail yards and frigid winter winds penetrated the poorly insulated walls of the city textile mills, a vast network of laborers operated heavy industrial sewing machines. This was an environment defined by the relentless rhythm of needles driving through thick wool and heavy fabrics. It was a world of razor-thin profit margins, where success depended entirely on maximizing production volume while managing the complex logistics of raw material supply chains. In this grueling environment, the primary output was heavy winter coats, goods that required durable construction to survive the harsh urban elements. There was no apparent connection between the textile trade and the heavy machinery required to build automobiles. To understand the anomaly of this industrial crossover, one must examine the highly fragmented nature of early automobile production. During the 1920s, the automotive industry had not yet fully embraced the concept of vertical integration, where a single company manufactured every component of a vehicle. The landscape was largely divided between companies that built the mechanical chassis, housing the engine and transmission, and separate enterprises known as coach builders. These coach builders operated independent factories where they constructed the wooden frames, shaped the sheet metal bodies, and tailored the interior cabins, which were then mounted onto the purchased chassis. A specific company located in Kalamazoo, Michigan, operated as one of these specialized commercial coach builders. Situated in a modest red brick factory facility near the regional freight lines, this struggling enterprise focused on manufacturing body shells specifically designed for taxi service. The physical environment of Kalamazoo, a growing industrial hub surrounded by dense forests and vital waterways, provided the necessary resources and logistical access for regional manufacturing. However, the business model of this particular factory was fundamentally flawed. They were attempting to build commercial taxi bodies to fit onto standard passenger car frames. The operational reality of early urban transit was incredibly destructive. Standard passenger vehicles were engineered for casual use by private citizens. When these light-duty frames and suspensions were subjected to the grueling demands of commercial taxi service, carrying thousands of passengers through congested, unpaved, and pothole-ridden city streets for 12 hours a day, they disintegrated. The mechanical failures were constant, and the bodies attached to them rattled apart under the stress. Consequently, the taxi operating companies that purchased these vehicles faced catastrophic maintenance costs, and their dissatisfaction flowed directly back up the supply chain to the coach builders. By 1922, the red brick factory in Kalamazoo was facing imminent financial collapse. Their cash flow had dried up. Their reputation was suffering due to the inherent weakness of the vehicles they were assembling, and their ledger was filled with outstanding liabilities. Among these critical debts was a substantial unpaid invoice owed to a specific garment manufacturing operation in Chicago. The connection between the two seemingly unrelated industries was the interior upholstery. The Chicago garment factory, utilizing its expertise in heavy-duty sewing and material handling, had been contracted to supply the thick leather seat covers and durable cabin linings required for the Kalamazoo taxi bodies. As the Kalamazoo operation stalled, it defaulted on its payments for these materials. The debt grew to a point where it threatened the financial stability of the textile supplier. In the standard mechanics of corporate finance, a defaulted debt of this nature usually resulted in a harsh liquidation process. The creditor would force the failing company into bankruptcy, sell off the physical assets, auction the heavy machinery, and attempt to recoup a fraction of the lost revenue. It was a mechanical, unforgiving procedure designed to minimize losses. However, instead of initiating a hostile liquidation, a radically unorthodox decision was made by the leadership of the Chicago garment operation. They conducted an audit of the failing Kalamazoo plant, analyzing the structural failures of the business not just as a financial deficit, but as a failure of manufacturing philosophy. They recognized that the demand for urban transportation was growing exponentially across American cities, but the product being offered was fundamentally inadequate for the task. The decision was unprecedented. Rather than writing off the debt or dismantling the facility for scrap, the garment manufacturing company absorbed the debt by taking full equity of the automotive plant. The tailor shop acquired the car factory. This acquisition initiated a violent collision of two distinct industrial cultures. The operational philosophy, brought from the textile floors of Chicago to the assembly lines of Kalamazoo, was stripped of any romanticism or automotive prestige. It was a cold, calculated observation of consumer economics and utilitarian function. The guiding principle of this new industrial regime was remarkably extreme for the era. The philosophy dictated that whether a factory was producing a heavy winter coat or a commercial passenger vehicle, the fundamental mechanics of utility and value remained identical. If a manufacturer produced cheap, fragile goods, those goods would inevitably tear, break, and disintegrate under the stress of daily use. The customer would be forced into a continuous cycle of expensive replacements, and the manufacturer would eventually be cursed and abandoned by the market. Conversely, if a product was over-engineered to withstand relentless punishment, if it was built to exist indefinitely without failure, it would forge absolute trust. A machine that refused to die would ultimately dominate the industry through sheer economic reliability. With this uncompromising doctrine established, the physical transformation of the Kalamazoo facility began. The red brick factory ceased to be a passive assembler of disparate parts. The new ownership fundamentally rejected the fragmented coach building model. They realized that putting a well-built taxi body onto a weak passenger chassis was a futile exercise. To guarantee absolute durability, they had to control every variable of the machine's construction. The factory systematically canceled its contracts to build piecemeal bodies for other automotive brands. The facility was reorganized, heavy metal presses were secured, and the assembly lines were reconfigured for a singular, integrated purpose. The enterprise abandoned the practice of modifying existing consumer vehicles and embarked on an entirely new industrial trajectory. They began the complex process of designing and fabricating a heavy-duty chassis, a reinforced steel body, and a spacious, indestructible interior as one unified, purpose-built machine. The acquisition, born from an unpaid debt for leather upholstery, catalyzed a complete systemic pivot. The clattering hum of the Chicago sewing machines had successfully financed the roar of the Michigan welding torches. By rejecting the era's standard practices of planned obsolescence and fragmented assembly, the factory at Kalamazoo isolated itself from the rest of the automotive industry. They stopped building cars for the general public and focused entirely on forging an unbreakable commercial tool. This transition marked the definitive end of a struggling coach builder and the brutal, calculated birth of a manufacturing empire that would soon monopolize the streets of every major city in the nation. The American urban landscape of the 1920s was a brutal testing ground for mechanical engineering. As metropolitan populations swelled and paved roads remained inconsistent, the demand for point-to-point public transit accelerated rapidly. However, the machines tasked with this labor were fundamentally inadequate. Fleet operators across major cities were purchasing mass-produced civilian sedans, painting them in uniform colors, and dispatching them into commercial service. These vehicles were designed for the leisure and occasional commuting of private families. When subjected to the unforgiving mathematics of the taxi industry, running 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, through congested traffic and over deeply rutted avenues, the passenger cars systematically disintegrated. The physical toll on these modified vehicles was absolute. Standard suspensions collapsed under the constant, heavy loading and unloading of passengers and luggage. The narrow doors, designed for occasional use, warped on their hinges from being violently opened and slammed shut hundreds of times a shift. The lightweight frames cracked under the repetitive stress of city potholes. For a fleet owner, a standard automobile was effectively a depreciating liability that would be shaken to pieces and require total replacement in under 24 months. It was within this environment of mechanical failure that the factory in Kalamazoo introduced a radical paradigm shift. Having reorganized their entire production model to control every aspect of manufacturing, they released a vehicle designed from its very inception to be a commercial workhorse. This new machine discarded all contemporary automotive trends. It ignored the emerging consumer desires for aerodynamic styling, sloping rooflines, and sporting aesthetics. Instead, it was an unapologetic, utilitarian steel box. The engineering architecture was defined by brute strength. The foundation was a heavy ladder frame constructed of thick steel rails, capable of absorbing impact without transferring the kinetic energy into the passenger cabin. The doors were widened significantly, allowing passengers to enter and exit without physical contortion, and hung on massive, overbuilt hinges that could support the weight of a grown adult. Perhaps the most defining engineering decision of this era involved the powertrain, establishing a philosophy that contradicted the rest of the automotive industry. In Detroit, manufacturers were engaged in a fierce competition to maximize engine horsepower, marketing speed, and acceleration to the American public. The engineers in Kalamazoo took the opposite approach. They collaborated with their engine suppliers to deliberately restrict the power output of their motors. If a standard commercial engine was capable of producing 100 horsepower, the factory governed it to produce only 85. This decision to intentionally understress the engine was a masterstroke of industrial economics. By operating well below its maximum thermal and mechanical thresholds, the engine experienced drastically reduced internal friction. The metal components ran cooler, the bearings suffered less wear, and the oil degraded at a slower rate. A motor that would normally burn out after 100,000 miles of city driving could now survive 3 times as long without requiring a major rebuild. The vehicle was undeniably slow, but it was relentless. This mechanical resilience was immediately tested by the chaotic and highly dangerous realities of the transit market. During the Prohibition era, the taxi industry in Chicago was not merely a competitive business. It was a violent, territorial war. Rival syndicates and fleet owners fought for control of lucrative transit hubs, utilizing intimidation, sabotage, and physical destruction to bankrupt their competitors. Drivers were frequently caught in the crossfire, subjected to beatings, while vehicles were routinely rammed, overturned, or firebombed in the middle of the night. In this hostile environment, the Kalamazoo vehicle functioned as a civilian armored transport. The heavy-gauge steel body panels resisted impacts that would crumple a standard sedan. The reinforced chassis allowed the cars to absorb deliberate collisions and remain operational. Fleet owners quickly realized that while a competitor's destroyed vehicle was a total financial loss, the heavy-duty taxi could be recovered, the thick steel hammered back into shape, and the machine returned to the streets to generate revenue. For the drivers navigating the dangerous night shifts, the sheer mass and solidity of the vehicle provided a vital psychological and physical barrier between themselves and the violence of the city. The industrial logic of the Kalamazoo factory faced an entirely different existential threat at the end of the decade. The stock market collapse of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression evaporated the capital required to run large transit fleets. Banks stopped issuing loans, and taxi companies could no longer afford to continuously purchase replacement vehicles every 2 years. The market contracted violently, driving dozens of automotive manufacturers and coach builders into bankruptcy. The factory in Michigan, however, survived the economic devastation precisely because of its rigid engineering philosophy. In an economy where capital expenditure was impossible, absolute longevity became the only metric of value. The fleet operators who managed to stay in business did so because the indestructible machines they had already purchased simply refused to break down. The initial premium paid for the heavy-duty vehicles was justified as the cars operated for 5, 6, and 7 years, through the worst economic crisis in national history, requiring only rudimentary maintenance. The sheer survival of these fleets served as unassailable proof of the factory's concept, the ultimate validation of the company's systems, and its most critical climactic shift arrived in 1942. Following the nation's entry into the Second World War, the federal government established the War Production Board, which immediately mandated the total cessation of all civilian automobile manufacturing. Factories across the country were ordered to halt their assembly lines. For many specialized manufacturers, this mandate resulted in the immediate termination of their workforce, scattering highly skilled laborers to other industries or military service, effectively dismantling the institutional knowledge of the company. The leadership in Kalamazoo faced the prospect of losing the multi-generational workforce of master welders, fabricators, and assemblers that had taken decades to cultivate. The community of Kalamazoo, heavily dependent on the wages generated by the factory, braced for severe economic contraction. To preserve the industrial ecosystem they had built, the factory executed an aggressive logistical pivot. Utilizing their heavy manufacturing capabilities, they secured federal defense contracts and completely retooled the facility. The massive hydraulic presses that had previously stamped steel taxi fenders were recalibrated to form heavy artillery shell casings. The precision welding bays, normally used to fuse automotive frames, were transitioned to the assembly of complex aircraft components and rugged parts for military transport vehicles. This rapid transformation had a profound impact on the local community. By converting to a war footing, the factory ensured that its vast network of tradesmen remained continuously employed throughout the global conflict. The specialized skills of the workforce were not only preserved, but sharpened under the strict tolerances required for military aviation and munitions. When the conflict finally concluded in 1945 and the federal government authorized the resumption of civilian manufacturing, the automotive landscape was fundamentally altered. Competing manufacturers struggled for months to rehire laborers, train new workers, and rebuild their supply chains. In Kalamazoo, there was no such delay. The factory simply swapped the military dies out of the stamping presses and returned the original automotive molds. The workforce was already in place, highly disciplined, and completely synchronized. Because they had navigated the crucible of the war without dismantling their human infrastructure, the factory emerged from the conflict positioned to completely dominate the post-war economic boom, ready to unleash the most prolific era of manufacturing in their history. As the post-war economic boom propelled the United States into the 1950s, the broader American automotive industry underwent a radical transformation. In Detroit, the massive conglomerates of Ford and General Motors were aggressively pursuing automation. They were investing heavily in moving assembly lines, early robotics, and a streamlined manufacturing philosophy known as unibody construction, where a vehicle's frame and body were stamped as a single, lightweight shell. This methodology prioritized speed, cost reduction, and rapid consumer turnover. 140 miles to the west, the factory in Kalamazoo rejected this evolution entirely. Driven by the capital reserves accumulated during their wartime defense contracts, the operation expanded not by adopting modern automation, but by doubling down on heavy, manual manufacturing. The facility swelled into a sprawling industrial fortress, a sprawling complex of brick and corrugated steel that functioned as an isolated kingdom of brute force engineering. The manufacturing philosophy within this fortress was absolute and uncompromising. Every vehicle that moved across the Kalamazoo floor adhered strictly to the traditional body-on-frame architecture. The foundation of the machine consisted of two massive parallel steel rails, resembling railroad tracks, which ran the entire length of the chassis. This was an incredibly heavy, expensive, and time-consuming method of construction. However, the physics were undeniable. When a unibody passenger car struck a deep pothole at 40 miles per hour, the impact reverberated through the entire sheet metal structure, eventually causing microscopic stress fractures that led to catastrophic failure. When a Kalamazoo frame absorbed that exact same impact, the heavy steel rails swallowed the kinetic energy completely, isolating the passenger cabin from the violence of the road. This obsession with structural invulnerability dictated every component bolted to the frame. The passenger doors were engineered with a sheer mass that defied standard automotive practices. Each door weighed over 60 pounds, hung on forged heavy-duty steel hinges designed to withstand being violently thrown open against city curbs thousands of times a week. The manufacturing tolerances were so precise and the materials so dense that when a worker slammed one of these doors shut, it did not produce the tinny rattle of a standard civilian car. It produced a deep, resonant thud, an acoustic signature that closely mimicked the closing of a reinforced steel bank vault. Yet the creation of this mechanical permanence required a profound human sacrifice. Behind the marketing brochures that touted the vehicle's indestructible nature lay a deeply problematic secondary reality concerning the conditions of its manufacture. Because the factory eschewed automation, the physical burden of manipulating, aligning, and securing these massive steel components fell entirely on the human body. The heart of the Kalamazoo fortress was the heavy welding division, an environment of extreme sensory overload and physical hazard. In an era before the strict enforcement of occupational safety regulations, the conditions inside the welding bays were grueling. The cavernous rooms were constantly illuminated by the blinding, erratic flashes of hundreds of arc welders operating simultaneously. The ambient noise was deafening, a relentless acoustic assault of pneumatic hammers, grinding wheels, and high-voltage electrical arcs that easily exceeded safe decibel limits. More insidious than the noise was the atmosphere itself. The high-temperature fusion of heavy-gauge steel produced a constant, thick haze of toxic particulate matter. The air was perpetually saturated with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone, vaporized flux, and burning industrial lubricants. Ventilation systems, completely inadequate for the volume of work being performed, struggled to clear the noxious clouds that hung just beneath the factory rafters. To build an immortal machine, the factory systematically extracted the physical vitality of its workforce. The men who spent 12-hour shifts wrestling 60-pound doors into alignment and guiding heavy welding torches along the steel undercarriages paid for the vehicle's durability with their own physiological degradation. The relentless noise steadily eroded their hearing, resulting in widespread profound deafness among the veteran floor workers. The daily inhalation of welding fumes and metallic dust settled deep into their respiratory systems, leading to chronic, debilitating lung conditions. Knees and lumbar spines deteriorated rapidly under the repetitive strain of lifting and maneuvering heavy steel components without the aid of modern pneumatic hoists. This systemic physical exploitation was obscured by a powerful, carefully cultivated corporate narrative of generational pride. The management of the factory did not frame the grueling labor as a hazard, but rather as a highly specialized, elite craft. They actively encouraged a culture of nepotism, creating a closed loop of employment that bound entire local families to the assembly line. This sociological phenomenon became the defining characteristic of the Kalamazoo workforce. A master frame welder who first walked onto the factory floor in 1946, having returned from the war, would spend 2 decades sacrificing his joints and his lungs to the company. By 1966, When his physical capacity began to fail, the system provided an immediate replacement. He would literally walk his 18-year-old son onto the exact same floor, placing the heavy welding torch into the young man's hands. The climactic shift in the factory's internal dynamic was not marked by a sudden labor strike or a catastrophic mechanical failure, but by this silent, institutionalized transfer of physical burden. The moment a father trained his son to listen for the specific, resonant pitch of a perfect weld, he was simultaneously passing down a legacy of guaranteed physical deterioration. The workers took immense genuine pride in the fact that the vehicles they built would outlast most modern structures. They knew the machines were virtually indestructible. But the tragic irony of the Kalamazoo fortress was that the product survived only because the men building it were willing to be consumed. They were not merely assembling automobiles. They were forging urban tanks, using the blood, sweat, and cartilage of their own bloodlines as the ultimate raw material. The factory had successfully created a machine that defeated time by extracting that time directly from the lifespans of its creators. The severe physiological sacrifice extracted from the Kalamazoo workforce yielded an industrial dividend that fundamentally reshaped the American urban landscape. By the late 1950s, the grueling labor and toxic atmosphere within the heavy welding bays materialized into an era of unprecedented, absolute market dominance. The Checker Motors Corporation introduced the Marathon, a vehicle that would not merely compete within the commercial transit sector, but would entirely consume it, initiating a golden age of manufacturing that lasted unbroken for over 2 decades. The rapid saturation of the taxi market was governed by cold, calculated fleet mathematics. A purpose-built Checker Marathon carried a significant retail premium, costing roughly 30% more than a mass-produced Ford or Chevrolet sedan equipped with a heavy-duty fleet package. However, transit managers operating out of vast, concrete garages in the Bronx or the South Side of Chicago did not evaluate commercial vehicles based on initial purchase price. They calculated the total cost of ownership against a grueling depreciation cycle. A standard Detroit sedan would physically collapse under the punishing kinetic environment of commercial service within 3 years. The Checker, bolstered by its massive steel ladder frame and governed engine, would comfortably and reliably operate for a decade. This calculated durability allowed the Checker Marathon to systematically shatter established mechanical boundaries. Standard automotive engineering of the era considered 100,000 miles to be the absolute terminal lifespan of a passenger vehicle. In stark contrast, Checkers operating in major metropolitan hubs ran 24 hours a day, transferred between 3 different drivers in consecutive 8-hour shifts. The engines rarely had the opportunity to cool to ambient temperature. Under these relentless conditions, the vehicles routinely surpassed 300,000 miles. With disciplined, rudimentary maintenance schedules consisting solely of replacing fluids, brake shoes, and worn suspension belts, fleet operators documented engine blocks and chassis reaching 500,000 and occasionally breaching 700,000 miles without requiring a catastrophic overhaul. This defiance of physical wear translated directly into an absolute, unassailable monopoly. Through the 1960s and deep into the 1970s, the visual profile of the Eastern Seaboard's traffic arteries was fundamentally altered. In New York City, over 60% of all licensed transit medallions were affixed to the heavy steel hoods of Checker Marathons. In Chicago, the market saturation reached an astounding 70%. The Kalamazoo facility meticulously maintained a highly controlled production volume, manufacturing approximately 8,000 units annually. While this figure represented a mere fraction of a percent of total American passenger automobile production, within the highly specialized niche of fleet transit, 8,000 indestructible units a year constituted a reigning dynasty. The dominance of the Checker was not solely an economic phenomenon. It was profoundly spatial, profoundly altering the daily experience of the American public. The architecture of the Marathon featured a 120-inch wheelbase, extending nearly half a foot longer than competing commercial vehicles. This elongated chassis permitted an interior geometry that transformed the rear cabin from a mere seating arrangement into a cavernous mobile room. The floor pan was entirely flat, eliminating the intrusive transmission tunnel common in standard rear-wheel drive sedans. This structural luxury allowed for the installation of folding rear jump seats, enabling the vehicle to comfortably swallow 6 adults and their assorted luggage. For the millions of citizens navigating the metropolitan grid, the Checker ceased to be perceived as an automobile and became an essential component of the civic infrastructure, functioning with the reliability and permanence of the subterranean subway networks. Passengers stepping through the heavy bank vault doors entered an environment physically isolated from the chaotic noise of the avenues. For the professional drivers, the upright seating posture, heavy steering linkage, and commanding visibility turned the vehicle into a predictable, armored vessel. It protected their physical safety and guaranteed their economic livelihood, insulating them from the rapid depreciation and sudden mechanical anxieties that plagued operators of standard, mass-produced sedans. Because the machines were built to survive indefinitely, they accumulated on the streets, compounding year after year until they achieved a striking visual ubiquity. Furthermore, the management at the Kalamazoo Fortress flatly refused to alter the exterior design. The boxy shape, the vertical front grille, and the bulbous heavy-gauge fenders remained virtually unchanged from 1958 onward. This aggressive, static continuity inadvertently elevated the Marathon into a cultural monolith. The vehicle evolved beyond a commercial tool and became the definitive visual shorthand for the American city. The global cinematic industry quickly recognized the semiotic power of this static, unyielding design. When Hollywood directors and location scouts needed to establish the gritty, authentic reality of an urban narrative, the Checker was the necessary visual anchor. In landmark cinematic works of the era, such as Taxi Driver and The French Connection, the yellow Checker did not function merely as a background prop. It was utilized as a defining geographical signifier. A wide camera shot of that distinctive boxy yellow silhouette navigating a crowded avenue instantly communicated to a global audience that the ensuing drama was inextricably bound to the concrete canyons and relentless pulsing rhythm of an American metropolis. By the mid-1970s, the factory at Kalamazoo had achieved an industrial zenith that few manufacturing institutions ever experience. They had engineered a product so flawlessly adapted to its specific environment that the very concept of competition simply evaporated. The golden era of Checker Motors was defined by this absolute, unyielding stability. The factory operated in a state of continuous, highly profitable equilibrium, churning out thousands of immortal yellow machines that ruled the nation's asphalt grids with impunity. This climactic peak of market dominance, however, birthed a dangerous and profound institutional blindness. The executives in Michigan viewed their market share and the mechanical perfection of their product as permanent fixtures of the American economy. They believed they had conquered the transit industry through sheer brute durability, creating a fortress that could never be breached. But their monumental success was entirely predicated on a specific set of external macroeconomic conditions, namely cheap domestic oil, localized supply chains, and an absence of federal regulatory intervention. As the endless rows of yellow Checkers formed an invincible moving perimeter around Times Square, the factory leadership failed to recognize that the tectonic plates of the global economy were preparing to shift violently. The very perfection, mass, and static nature of the machine that had built the empire was about to become the precise mechanism of its swift and brutal destruction. The industrial fortress that had been meticulously constructed in Kalamazoo was designed to withstand any physical impact the urban environment could deliver. For half a century, the company operated under the assumption that if they built an unbreakable machine, they would remain economically invincible. However, the architecture of their success contained a fatal flaw. They had engineered a vehicle perfectly adapted to a static world, assuming the external conditions of the mid-20th century, cheap energy, localized supply chains, and unregulated manufacturing, would exist in perpetuity. They were entirely unprepared for the macroeconomic shockwaves that were about to violently reshape the global landscape. The first fracture in the foundation of the Chequer Empire occurred in the autumn of 1973. The geopolitical stability of the energy sector collapsed when the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries instituted an oil embargo against the United States. Almost overnight, the price of crude oil quadrupled. Gasoline stations across American cities ran dry, and rationing protocols resulted in fuel lines stretching for miles. The entire domestic economy convulsed, and suddenly, the metric of automotive value shifted fundamentally. Under these new, harsh realities, the physical attributes that made the Chequer Marathon an engineering marvel instantly transformed into catastrophic liabilities. The massive steel ladder frame, the dense body panels, and the overbuilt mechanical linkages possessed an immense physical mass. Moving that sheer weight through endless cycles of stop-and-go, city traffic required tremendous kinetic energy. Consequently, the marathon averaged a dismal 10 miles to the gallon. Inside the concrete taxi garages of New York and Chicago, fleet managers were forced to confront a brutal new arithmetic. The cost of fuel had abruptly superseded the cost of vehicle depreciation. Competing models from Detroit, though mechanically inferior and prone to rapid deterioration, were significantly lighter and could achieve up to 16 miles to the gallon. For a commercial vehicle driven 50,000 miles a year, that difference in fuel efficiency was astronomical. The excess gasoline required to operate a Chequer for 12 months now eclipsed the cost of simply buying a brand new, lightweight Ford sedan. The core economic argument that had sustained the Kalamazoo factory for decades, that higher upfront costs were justified by infinite durability, evaporated. Sensing blood in the water, the massive automotive conglomerates in Detroit initiated a ruthless invasion of the commercial fleet sector. Ford and General Motors did not attempt to defeat Chequer by engineering a superior, longer-lasting taxi. Instead, they weaponized their sheer corporate scale to create an environment where Chequer simply could not compete. They flooded the market with predatory financial instruments, utilizing their captive credit arms to offer fleet operators financing at an incredibly low 2% interest rate. Chequer, relying on standard commercial bank loans, could offer nothing less than 7%. Furthermore, the Detroit Giants possessed thousands of dealerships nationwide, guaranteeing immediate parts availability. If a Ford taxi broke a water pump, a replacement was minutes away. If a Chequer suffered a similar failure, parts had to be shipped by freight from Michigan, resulting in days of lost revenue. This corporate siege forced a painful secondary consequence upon the independent taxi operators, many small fleet owners, whose families had exclusively purchased Chequers for generations, found themselves trapped. Facing astronomical fuel bills, they simply did not have the cash flow to maintain their loyalty to Kalamazoo. Driven by the primal instinct of financial survival, they began abandoning the heavy, yellow machines for cheaper, disposable Detroit sedans. The visual monopoly of the Chequer on city streets began to visibly thin. However, the climactic and ultimately fatal blow to the Kalamazoo empire did not originate from foreign oil cartels or rival executives in Detroit. It was administered by the federal government in Washington. Throughout the 1970s, a wave of unprecedented regulatory legislation swept over the automotive industry. Congress enacted the Clean Air Act, mandating strict reductions in tailpipe emissions, while the newly formed National Highway Traffic Safety Administration introduced rigorous structural standards for crash survivability and impact-absorbing bumpers. These statutory mandates were designed with the noble intention of forcing massive corporations to build safer, cleaner vehicles. But the legislation possessed a cold, mathematical indifference to the realities of scale. The new laws applied equally to all domestic manufacturers, regardless of their size or production volume. For the Chequer Motors Corporation, These regulations constituted a legal vice that began to crush the life out of the factory. Because Checker operated as an independent, low-volume manufacturer, they did not design or cast their own engine blocks. They relied entirely on purchasing complete powertrains from outside suppliers, primarily the Chevrolet division of General Motors. When these suppliers were forced to redesign their engines and add complex catalytic converter technologies to meet federal emissions targets, they simply passed the massive research and development costs down the supply chain. Checker had absolutely no negotiating leverage. They were forced to accept the dramatically inflated prices for clean engines, instantly wiping out their already razor-thin profit margins. The structural safety mandates proved even more devastating. The federal government required extensive crash testing to certify that vehicles could withstand high-speed impacts. For a conglomerate like Ford, compliance was a manageable logistical expense. If Ford spent $200 million re-engineering a chassis and destroying dozens of prototypes in a crash laboratory, they amortized that expense across 2 million passenger vehicles sold that year. The cost of federal compliance equated to a mere $100 penalty per car, which was seamlessly hidden in the retail sticker price. For Kalamazoo, the exact same statutory requirements triggered a financial death spiral. To redesign their archaic body-on-frame architecture to meet modern crash standards would require an estimated $10 million in engineering and testing. But Checker was only producing their highly specialized 8,000 units a year. The arithmetic was merciless and undeniable. Amortizing a $10 million compliance cost over 8,000 vehicles, resulted in a penalty of over $1,200 per car. Inside the cavernous brick walls of the Michigan plant, the atmosphere shifted from generational pride to a creeping, suffocating dread. The master craftsmen standing on the assembly lines realized that the extreme durability of their product, the very thing that defined their existence, was now legally irrelevant. The corporate leadership, paralyzed by decades of static success and deeply entrenched in their conservative philosophy, stubbornly refused to compromise the vehicle's heavy architecture to reduce costs. They were held captive by the mythology of their own indestructible machine. By the late 1970s, a terrifying financial paradox had taken hold of the factory. The raw materials, labor, and massive regulatory compliance penalties combined to push the manufacturing cost of a Checker Marathon significantly higher than its selling price. If they raised the price to cover the losses, fleet owners would immediately defect to Ford. If they kept the price stable, the company bled capital. Every single yellow taxi that proudly rolled off the assembly line and into the American streets actively drained the lifeblood from the corporation. The fortress had not been breached by a superior piece of engineering. It had been systematically suffocated by the inescapable crushing mathematics of the mass market. By the dawn of the 1980s, the sprawling industrial fortress in Kalamazoo was operating under a terminal diagnosis. The lethal combination of soaring global fuel prices, crushing regulatory compliance penalties, and predatory financing from Detroit conglomerates had fundamentally inverted the mathematics of the Checker Motors Corporation. The enterprise was trapped in a financial paradox where the very act of manufacturing a heavy-duty automobile actively eroded the company's remaining capital. Following the death of founder Morris Markin in 1978, the corporate leadership, now directed by his son David Markin, was forced into a series of desperate tactical maneuvers to forestall the inevitable collapse of the assembly lines. The initial strategy for survival involved an aggressive attempt to pivot the core product toward the civilian market. The company launched marketing campaigns attempting to rebrand the indestructible Checker Marathon as a premium, ultra-spacious family vehicle. They highlighted the cavernous rear seating and the proven safety of the massive steel frame. The initiative was a catastrophic failure. The American consumer, grappling with a severe recession and record-high gasoline prices, had no interest in purchasing a vehicle that achieved 10 miles to the gallon and possessed the aerodynamic profile of a concrete block. The static, unyielding aesthetic that had made the Checker a cultural icon of the commercial transit sector rendered it completely unsellable to the private suburban family. As consumer sales failed to materialize and fleet operators continued to defect to cheaper alternatives, the leadership attempted to sustain the facility through contract manufacturing. The massive hydraulic presses and fabrication bays were leased out to perform piecemeal work for other corporations. The factory that had once dictated the visual identity of the American city was reduced to stamping sheet metal components for General Motors, assembling specialized paratransit vans, and performing custom modifications for elongated limousines. These were desperate stopgap measures that yielded unpredictable volumes and razor-thin profit margins. They could not generate the sustained capital required to maintain a 1 million square foot manufacturing complex. The physical reality of a dying industrial plant began to manifest visually across the Kalamazoo campus. Vast sectors of the facility were permanently powered down to conserve electricity. Thick layers of industrial dust settled on inactive stamping presses and idle conveyor systems. The deafening, relentless roar of heavy production that had defined the local environment for half a century was replaced by the hollow, echoing sounds of a skeleton crew operating at a fraction of the plant's capacity. This deceleration inflicted a profound psychological and structural toll on the workforce. The multi-generational employment cycle, the closed loop of fathers passing their heavy welding torches to their sons, fractured completely. As production plummeted, the factory was forced to execute massive layoffs. Governed by strict union seniority protocols, the dismissals targeted the youngest workers first. The sons and nephews who had recently entered the facility to inherit the trades of their families were systematically purged from the payroll. This structural reality left behind an increasingly aging demographic of master craftsmen. Men in their late 50s and early 60s, possessing decades of institutional knowledge, found themselves wandering through largely abandoned sectors of the factory. They were relegated to sweeping concrete floors or performing menial equipment maintenance, simply attempting to justify their hourly wages while waiting for sporadic contract orders to materialize. Production volumes entered a rapid death spiral. In 1978, output had fallen to 3,000 units. By 1980, it barely scraped past 1,000. As the volume dropped, the fixed overhead costs of maintaining the massive facility had to be divided among fewer and fewer completed taxis, driving the per-unit manufacturing cost exponentially higher. It was a mathematical trap from which there was no extraction. In the summer of 1982, the corporate leadership confronted the inescapable reality of their ledger. The enterprise was hemorrhaging money. With every vehicle that reached the end of the line, the decision was made to entirely abandon the manufacture of automobiles. There was no grandiose press conference, no appeals for federal bailouts, and no coordinated public relations campaign to soften the blow. The termination of a 60-year American automotive dynasty was executed with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of a standard accounting maneuver. The company quietly announced that it would transition exclusively to third-party parts manufacturing. The era of the Checker taxi was over. On July 12, 1982, the final Checker automobile advanced down the primary assembly line. It was an olive green Marathon, assigned the production sequence number of 829 for the calendar year. This abysmal figure, 829 vehicles built over the course of 7 months, stood in stark, humiliating contrast to the 8,000 units that once rolled out annually during the Empire's golden era. The assembly of this final unit was not treated as a historic or sentimental milestone by the men on the floor. There was no celebratory brass band, no commemorative speeches from the executive board, and no gathering of the press to document the end of an era. To the remaining workforce, it was simply the last piece of inventory moving through a terminating system. When the final shift horn sounded on that July afternoon, the physical production of the Checker taxi ceased forever. Hundreds of aging workers punched their time cards, gathered their heavy steel lunchboxes, and walked out of the brick fortress in absolute silence. The sudden cessation of the assembly line permanently severed the social contract between the factory and the surrounding community. The true tragedy of this industrial collapse, and its most severe human consequence, fell entirely upon the oldest veterans of the manufacturing floor. Consider the reality of a structural welder who had entered the Kalamazoo facility in 1952. For 3 decades, he had willingly subjected his body to the toxic metallic fumes, the blinding electrical arcs, and the severe physical degradation required to master a highly specialized craft. He possessed an elite, almost intuitive understanding of how to fuse a heavy steel ladder frame so perfectly that it would withstand 500,000 miles of urban abuse. He knew exactly how to align a 60-pound door by the acoustic resonance of its latch. But on the morning of July 13th, that encyclopedic mechanical knowledge was instantly rendered worthless. The broader American economy had transitioned. The surrounding automotive industry had fully embraced lightweight unibody construction, robotic spot welding, and computerized assembly tolerances. There was absolutely zero market demand for a 60-year-old tradesman whose singular expertise was hand-forging indestructible steel urban tanks. The mastery he had spent his entire adult life cultivating was strictly proprietary to a dead machine. It was entirely non-transferable. He was too young to qualify for a full federal retirement pension, yet far too old and hyper-specialized to be absorbed by a rapidly modernizing, automated labor market. The capitalist machine that had demanded the sacrifice of his physical youth, his lungs, and his hearing to build an immortal product now discarded him with terrifying indifference the precise moment that product was deemed economically inefficient. The Kalamazoo factory had survived the Great Depression, the Second World War, and the violent taxi syndicates of the Prohibition era, but it could not survive the merciless calculating arithmetic of the modern mass market, leaving its most loyal architects stranded in the silent wreckage of their own creation. In the immediate aftermath of the 1982 production halt, the sprawling industrial complex in Kalamazoo did not suffer the dramatic, explosive demolition that often accompanies corporate bankruptcy. Instead, it experienced a slow, agonizing institutional decay. The massive brick fortress that had once dictated the visual rhythm of the American metropolis was systematically stripped of its unified purpose. The vast assembly bays, originally engineered to forge indestructible urban transports, were awkwardly subdivided by chain-link fencing and leased to various third-party manufacturing entities. The facility became a hollow shell, utilizing its heavy hydraulic presses to stamp out generic anonymous sheet metal components for other automotive corporations. The localized ecosystem of multi-generational craftsmanship was entirely replaced by the sterile, fractured reality of contract fabrication. While the factory in Michigan had effectively died, the products it had spawned refused to expire. This created a profound chronological anomaly on the streets of American cities throughout the 1980s and deep into the 1990s. The production lines had stopped, meaning no new checkers were entering the transit fleets, but the heavy steel machines already in circulation simply continued to operate. Fleet owners, having already absorbed the initial purchase price, ran the marathons relentlessly, extracting every possible mile of revenue from the indestructible frames. As the years progressed, the visual contrast on the avenues became increasingly stark. The broader automotive industry was rapidly adopting sleek aerodynamic styling, computer-controlled fuel injection, and lightweight plastic composites. Amidst this modernization, the boxy, heavy-gauge yellow checkers lumbered through the traffic like mechanical dinosaurs. They were physical anachronisms, stubborn remnants of a defunct manufacturing philosophy, yet they reliably completed their daily shifts. The attrition rate was remarkably slow. When a checker was finally removed from service during this era, it was rarely due to a catastrophic structural failure. They were typically retired only when the cumulative cost of replacing worn-out external components eventually exceeded the revenue generated by the aging vehicle, or when increasingly strict municipal emissions regulations simply legislated them off the road. The definitive climactic validation of the Kalamazoo engineering doctrine did not occur in a testing laboratory, but on the chaotic streets of Manhattan, 17 years after the factory doors had permanently closed. In July of 1999, the final Checker Marathon, operating as a legally licensed medallion-bearing taxi in New York City, was officially retired from commercial service. This specific machine had been navigating the brutal, pothole-ridden grid of the city since 1978. It had survived the administration of 4 different mayors, witnessed the total architectural and cultural transformation of the metropolis, and accumulated nearly 500,000 miles on its odometer. The retirement of this vehicle in 1999 was not a failure of the machine. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of its superiority. The car was still functional. It was retired primarily because the local transit authority instituted mandatory age limits for commercial vehicles, effectively forcing the indestructible artifact off the grid. This final yellow cab served as a rolling monument to the master welders and fabricators who had lost their livelihoods decades earlier. It proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the central thesis of the Checker Motors Corporation was entirely correct. They had successfully built a machine capable of operating for 20 years under the most punishing commercial conditions on Earth. However, the survival of that final taxi illuminated a terrifying business reality. The very metric that defined their engineering triumph was the exact mechanism of their corporate suicide. The collapse of the Checker empire established one of the most ruthless and paradoxical lessons in modern industrial history: the curse of perfection. The global automotive market, much like the broader landscape of 20th century consumer capitalism, was entirely predicated on the concept of planned obsolescence. To sustain a massive manufacturing infrastructure, to pay thousands of workers, and to generate continuous returns for investors, a corporation required a consistent, predictable cycle of repeat consumption. The giants of Detroit understood this mathematical necessity. They engineered vehicles designed to perform adequately for a limited duration, typically 3 to 5 years in severe commercial service, before deteriorating to a point where replacement became economically preferable to repair. This calculated decay ensured that fleet operators would inevitably return to the dealership, injecting fresh capital into the manufacturing ecosystem. The leadership at Kalamazoo had engineered a product that actively destroyed this cycle of consumption. By pouring their finest materials, most rigorous manual labor, and uncompromising structural integrity into the Marathon, they created a product with a 2-decade lifespan. From an engineering perspective, it was a masterpiece. From a macroeconomic perspective, it was a fatal error. When a fleet operator purchased a Checker, that customer was effectively removed from the purchasing market for the next 15 to 20 years. The factory had built a commercial tool so perfect that it completely cannibalized its own future demand. In an economic system driven by the necessity of constant disposal and replacement, building a machine that never breaks is the fastest route to institutional death. Today, the surviving Checker Marathons exist in a state of profound irony. The heavy utilitarian vehicles, originally designed to endure the grimiest, most punishing working-class environments, have been entirely removed from the functional world. They are now highly coveted artifacts, locked away in pristine, climate-controlled automotive museums or meticulously restored by wealthy private collectors. These machines, built to be driven relentlessly through blizzards and gridlock, are now polished with microfiber cloths and trailered to classic car exhibitions. Their value has skyrocketed precisely because the methodology used to create them, the heavy manual labor, the overbuilt steel frames, the deliberate defiance of planned obsolescence, has been thoroughly eradicated from the modern industrial landscape. The yellow silhouette of the Checker cab remains frozen in the global consciousness as the definitive symbol of the mid-century American city. It continues to traverse the screen in countless cinematic revivals and historical documentaries. Yet, this enduring cultural immortality masks a brutal industrial truth. The legacy of the Checker Motors Corporation is not merely a story of a durable automobile. It is a testament to the unforgiving nature of economies of scale. The next time that iconic, boxy yellow profile flashes across a screen, it should be recognized not just as a prop of urban nostalgia, but as a monument to a specific tragic class of American labor. Behind the indestructible steel doors and the massive, unyielding frames are the ghosts of thousands of highly skilled craftsmen. These were men who poured their physical health, their hearing, and their generational knowledge into the relentless pursuit of mechanical permanence. They lost their factory, their livelihoods, and their community, standing not because they were incompetent, not because they cut corners, and not because they produced a flawed product. They were completely erased from the industrial landscape for the singular paradoxical crime of building a masterpiece far too well. Did you ever experience the bank vault slam of a Checker door? Or perhaps you remember the sheer scale of that cavernous back seat? Or do you believe that in modern business, engineering an indestructible product is simply a corporate death sentence? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you value these uncompromising dives into the rise, the reign, and the ultimate collapse of the industrial empires that shaped our world, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There are countless more silent factories waiting to surrender their histories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of our industrial past.